Hello, listeners. Been wondering how you can help the show? Probably not. But here are 5 things you can do. 1. Subscribe. Support the show by clicking the subscription link in the show notes. 2. Review on iTunes, on our website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, or on whatever app you listen to. 3. Donate. When you go to our website, click the cute coffee cup icon. Or in the show notes, click the subscription link. 4. Share. Sharing really is caring. Tell your friends and even your enemies to check out the show. 5. Watch. Wait a minute, it's a podcast, not a movie. Actually, it's both. Check the show notes to find out where to watch the documentary. You can also rent it on Prime Video. That's it. Oh, one last thing. Enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the bucolic Berkshires, nestled in western Massachusetts, home to hiking, skiing, Tanglewood concerts, theater, and... oh, the horror!
Hoosick Tunnel, the Bloody Pit, UFO abductions, Bigfoot, exorcism, murders at summer camp, ghosts in haunted castles, the old coot of Greylock.
Join us as we travel down and explore mysterious things in the Berkshires with Joe Durwin.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
All right, we're here with Joe Durwin, a folklore and historian of the Berkshires in Massachusetts, among many other things. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Cool. Now, give us, you do so much more than what I just said. Give us kind of an introduction or a smattering of all the things that you do.
You know, I'm a kind of sometimes journalist, content creator. I started writing a column about oddities in the Berkshires 16 years ago, and that's run in various forms in different publications. I like to follow things down rabbit holes, so sometimes I get way out of my intended field of expertise, and it's a good time. And it's certainly, I think the pursuit of information is a very important thing in our times.
You remind me of another guest I had, Jeff Belanger, who's a researcher for Ghost Adventures, New England Legends. You're kind of like the Western Mass version of him. You have many diverse interests, yet you've been kind of like very much tied to Western Massachusetts and the Berkshires. Can you tell our audience exactly what is the Berkshires? What are the kind of the towns within the Berkshires? And what are some of the maybe notable or famous or infamous names that they may not recall are associated with the Berkshires?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there's been kind of a lot of discussion and debate even over the last 150, 200 years about what exactly the region of the Berkshires, the technical county of Berkshire County in Massachusetts. So you have Berkshire County, Massachusetts is 32 towns in the westernmost part of the state, running south to north from the Connecticut border to the Vermont border, and bordering New York State as well. So in actual cultural practice, the idea of the Berkshires sometimes a bit of Vermont's included, sometimes a bit of New York, Connecticut, Twin Lake. It's funny because I'll be an hour or so out of Massachusetts, and I'll still see a business that's like Berkshire Landscaping or something like that. So there's a kind of a concept of the rural region kind of in a bigger sense. And that's sort of what I've stuck to as originally my column was for a publication that covered parts of 3 states. So I take a kind of liberal view on what my backyard for folklore and journalism is.
What are some of the names? What are some of the people from the Berkshires that we may be aware of, but not realize that they either were born here or spent a large portion of their lives in the Berkshires of Western Mass?
Well, right off the top, there's this amazing literary history in the 19th century in the Berkshires where you have Herman Melville living in Pittsfield, writing Moby Dick, pursuing a friendship with Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived in Lenox, this Stockbridge area, and he was writing in the Berkshires, and they were introduced to each other by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., another great eminent writer of the age. And then we had some phenomenal early female writers like Catherine Sedgwick and Edith Warren's estate, which is reputed to be quite haunted and is a major cultural venue in the county now. So you've got a lot of that kind of history. It's certainly a melting pot for cultural endeavors. And we have the Tanglewood home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and a lot of world-class theaters. So we're still kind of very much meshed in the larger cultural icons and having famous actors here in the summers.
Isn't like Norman Rockwell from that area? Or I know is
Yeah. Rockwell's home base was here. His house is now a museum, very well-renowned museum. Yeah, there's the Clark Art Museum has a major collection. And then, of course, we have the newer Massamoka Museum. So there's one of the largest kind of economic drivers for the county now is kind of that cultural history that goes back even to the early 1800s to William Cullen Bryant, one of the early major American poets based in the Berkshires and wrote extensively about the Berkshires and left a lot of folklore behind. So that's, aside from our industrial kind of roller coaster, this sort of cultural aspect of the Berkshires has been a huge part of the economy, the history, the day-to-day life.
Before we dive into some of the great stories and folklore of the Berkshires, I'd like to just talk about a couple of things that you've touched on in your past writing career and research. The first one is something called coulrophobia, or fear of clowns, which you wrote about in a study in 2004, which has actually been cited by several scientific papers and is a primary source on that subject in Wikipedia. What drove you to write about fear of clowns back in 2004?
Yeah, well, I think when I first wrote about it, it was kind of, I was still in college and I was looking for information about it because I think it was really becoming pretty prominent in pop culture. And I went looking for academic literature, this seemingly very common phobia, and it really wasn't there. So I had to dig a little deeper and I had to go into a few different disciplines and kind of compare everything from horror movies to the anthropology of clowning in indigenous cultures, and really try to piece together how and why of how this something that was really popular entertainment icon just a few decades ago went to being popular a horror meme as werewolves or vampires, this kind of perpetual monster.
Yeah, you're ahead of your time. Were you surprised at how often it was cited and referenced, that it really got some legs? Did that surprise you?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I think there's kind of within the study of coulrophobia, there's this sort of fascinating element of urban legend and mass hysteria where there've been these phantom clown panics where people report clowns really bothering children in metropolitan areas, and that, of course, has been going on for a while, but it really took off 4 years ago and kind of swept the entire country in a hugely public way that it hadn't before. So that was almost kind of, I've been waiting for years for that, and not really expecting it to ever blow up to that extent.
Was there any clowning happening in the Berkshires at all? Did that ever happen? Or was that something you just had an interest in, but it wasn't Berkshires based, but you just,
we're ahead of the curve.
No, I had read about a mass panic that they had in the Boston area in '81, which I was a young child, and so I had some historical background on that. But then in 2016, it did eventually hit the Berkshires, and it almost, I sort of almost knew what day it was going to, because the fascinating thing about what happened 4 years ago is, instead of most things like when they spread virally kind of in all directions because of the internet and it's all over the world at once, that was something that really seemed to happen by region. And it was like sightings in one county and then another county, and it was always like moving from one adjacent area to another. And it kind of slowly crept up the East Coast and slowly crept west. And it was like day by day, and you could almost tell by the news reports where it was going to be probably hit next. So yeah, I had even been in contact with the local school superintendent and police chief and things about how to handle it if it did hit here locally, which eventually there were, alleged reports, and just not to feed into it being the main thing, because it really is a kind of more of a cultural phenomenon and copycatism than anything.
Yeah, no, that's always fascinating. I mean, there's another thing that you are actually do, which I'd never heard of. It's got a name, which I don't think it's actually accurate for what it really is. It's called recyclercism, which is the art of ritual transformation of found objects, particularly like masks and dolls. Can you kind of give us some clarity on what that is and what drew you to it?
Oh, geez. Yeah. I mean, that's probably more of a hobby in my spare time that is acquired an overly pretentious name. Yeah. I like, I've never had any real artistic skill, drawing, painting, anything two-dimensional. But what has always been interesting to me is kind of reassembling toys and dolls. Even when I was a kid, I'd kind of take the head off one thing and put it on another and stuff like that. And, I've always had kind of a crafting impulse and attraction to adhesives and things like that. So yeah, I'll find old masks, mostly masks and dolls and things like that, and take it kind of in a creepy Martha Stewart sort of way, turn it into a very different kind of object.
Wow. Yeah. Were any of these objects ever haunted, or did you ever come across something you didn't know had like a doll that had maybe a curse or an entity attached to it, and you had some weird stuff happen after you recycled it?
Well, I always kind of played it safe because I tend to be a bit agnostic about these things, but I also why roll the dice? So when I find some new thing in a bin at Goodwill or something like that, I do kind of try to observe some. I don't want to say a cult necessarily, but I'll put it in a ring of salt or something for a couple of days, burn some sage around it, just make sure because it's funny because I kind of got into really doing that as a way to relax during a time when haunted dolls and stuff like that were just booming business on eBay. And I should have really gotten into that because I think a lot of people, they just find a doll and write up a creepy story, and it would sell for hundreds of dollars, just based on the story of. And it always kind of amazed me that people would want to buy this object that had allegedly created total havoc in someone else's home, but they're like, yeah, I gotta have that. So I probably should have monetized that a little better, but yeah.
You can still do it, my friend, because I see a lot of like the YouTube paranormal channels in the past couple of years that open up these boxes from the black web or whatever, or get these haunted dolls or these Duca boxes, whatever they call them. But yeah, you probably could still have a market for that. So now, with that as the setup, let's just go into have you regale us with some of the ghost stories and mysteries of the Berkshires. I'm going to throw out some topics, and if you could just kind of go off on it for a little bit. Let's start with the Hoosick Tunnel, the Bloody Pit. Want to give us kind of the backstory on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Hoosick Tunnel has been such a defining part of history and folklore in the Berkshires. It really changed the dynamic in a lot of ways. It was kind of, a lot of people have heard of the Big Dig in Massachusetts that we had not too long ago. And that was sort of this unending civic project, much like that. And this is basically a 5-mile hole that was punched in the Hoosick Mountain range. And it took 25 years to do it. Numerous delays and incredibly extensive loss of life. just a lot of really grisly death associated with it because it was using nitroglycerin early on in its invention and just punching through. At the time, it was the oldest train tunnel that had been attempted to go 5 miles through. So there was a lot of stories of workers just being absolutely, blown apart, disintegrated by nitroglycerin and falling down, the central shaft into poisonous gas and rubble. And so people died really badly there. And there were also certain incidences of violence and suicides and things that happened near or in the tunnel. So it pretty quickly took on, even by the late 19th century, already taken on a really sinister reputation as a place that was pretty badly haunted and pretty still unsafe. Even once it was open for use, there was quite a few deaths and derailments and, running steam engines through the tunnel, inadequate lighting. All told, well over 200 people have died in or around the tunnel. So it's been a perpetual kind of rite of passage, I think, for locals to go visit, one or the other portal of the tunnel, to walk down it, try to go in it, dare themselves to see how far they'll go. It is still an active freight train tunnel, so it's, it has an element of current danger too.
Wow.
So, it's really, it's really become a quite legendary location.
So, okay, wow. So it's still now. What are some of the more notable ghosts? If they're are there a couple that are the more you're likely to run into if you go in there late at night and are walking and not getting hit by a train?
Yeah, there's a guy named Ringo Kelly that was in there that died with Ned Brinkman and Billy Nash. They're three of the people that are talked about probably the most often. Brinkman and Nash were killed when Kelly accidentally set off some explosives, and then he was later found dead. So that's and then there's just, sometimes people will go through old clippings and find, just different. I mean, there's so many names to pick from. So if you're kind of inclined to go looking for EVPs or things like that, I think there's a lot of different names that people will call out into the tunnel sort of thing. But really, I mean, there's just so much death that I think it's almost more like the certain areas, like the central shaft where 13 men died, really, really badly at one point in the construction in a cave-in and things like that. But to access the central shaft, you got to go a good couple miles into this dark tunnel. So that's not for the light of heart.
Now, is this you're not supposed to go there, but people go anyways? Is there a certain time, a certain time in the morning where if you go at 1:11 or 3 a.m. or something? Or is it just pretty much more in the evening? There's a lot of bad karma there, and you could run across some of these people that were blown to pieces or something at some point.
The only strange thing that's happened to me personally, there was a point at which maybe about 10 years ago, I took a fellow journalist from a local magazine, and we were doing a kind of a Halloween time tour of spots around the Berkshires, and we ended off at the Hoosick Tunnel. We walked probably maybe a mile in. And the odd thing for us was that every time wind seemed to keep pushing into the tunnel at us, anytime when we started to try to walk out of the tunnel, it was huge wind pressure against us. But then we'd stop walking and stand still for a minute, and the wind would completely die off. We tried it 3 or 4 times, and it just kept happening. We'd walk forward, and the wind would just kind of hit you with this force, almost pushing us back into the tunnel. But then we just stopped walking out, and so that was a little weird.
Hey, everybody. This is your paranormal podcast pal, Bob Heskey. Every night I like to listen to videos on YouTube. But lately, with COVID, civil unrest, market volatility, politics, conspiracy theories, I just want to tune out. That's why I like Audible. What's Audible, you say? Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audio books, including some great horror and paranormal titles like A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, If It Bleeds by Stephen King, and The Boatman's Daughter by Andy Davidson.
This place is cursed.
Each month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, access to daily news digests if you actually want to hear the news, as well as guided meditation programs. Hey, we all need a little Zen now and again. And Audible is oh so easy. You can download titles and listen offline, anytime, anywhere, on any device. The app is free and can be installed in your smartphone or tablet. You can even listen across devices without losing your spot. How cool is that? If you can't decide what to listen to, no problem. You can keep your credits for up to a year and binge on your favorite series later on. So, here's the rub. The Afraid of Nothing podcast is stoked to partner with the audio bookworms at Audible to offer you a free 30-day trial membership. Just follow the link in the show notes, audibletrial.com/AON podcast.
Puedes repetir eso, por favor.
That's audibletrial.com/AON, all caps, podcast, lowercase. Full disclosure, I get a commission for everyone who signs up using that URL. But you get to try it for 30 days without a commitment. Using our custom URL doesn't cost you a penny and helps out the show if you do sign up. Nothing scary about that. So escape reality and pick up a book, an audio book, and listen to what's out there. Go to audibletrial.com/AON podcast after listening to the show. Something that happened a while ago, 1969, the Berkshire UFO sightings and abduction. I just watched on Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries, I think 2 nights ago, about that. You want to tell us? I mean, there are actually a series of UFO sightings in the Berkshires, but let's talk about this one first and any others that you're aware of.
Yeah, the 69 sightings, it's very interesting because it's become really prominent the last 10 years, increasingly, and even more so with the Unsolved Mysteries hit this year. I think that's probably the most high profile, but there's been a few television programs that have delved into it. But the interesting thing about that, from my point of view, is, there was a whole lot of years when I was looking for UFO sightings and cases and things like that. The one with the covered bridge in Sheffield in 1969 was not anywhere on the radar. It was never talked about. It was never publicly mentioned. It was never referenced in the media or print until 2009, when allegedly one of the Reed family started to had a new encounter and was abducted in Indiana, I believe. So that then led their family to discuss earlier things. And the Unsolved Mysteries, what it left out is almost more intriguing than some of the stuff that it featured. Because the full story that's been given to other UFO investigators over the years since the Reeds started discussing it was that was actually the 3rd out of 3 encounters where Matthew and Tom Reed were allegedly taken at a young age onto. I keep saying allegedly because I do have a certain amount of skepticism for this case, just because there are discrepancies in the way the story has been told at different times over the years, and certainly the doubts that anyone might have when you're talking about long ago testimony, especially from people who were very young, under 10 years old at the time. So that I think there's a lot of murk around that, but it has certainly become probably the most media publicized and famous UFO connection to the Berkshires. What's really interesting to me is at the time, during the years that those abductions were allegedly happening to the Reeds, there was a guy a couple of towns away in the Berkshires who was writing article after article after article about his own contacts with an alien species that he called the Corendians, that had a heavy presence on the planet and an underground base under one of the mountains of the Berkshires. And his materials, there's well over 100 pages of these articles that he wrote all through the mid to late 60s in Flying Saucer Monthly. So not really capturing the broad public eye, but within UFO circles, I think they were hearing about the Berkshires very often through the work of Bob Renaud and his chronicles. So, but it also kind of illustrates the way UFO lore has tended to change on the tone and the narrative of stories. At the time Bob Renaud was writing, that was still really in the contactee period, where people were George Adamski and people were talking to Venusians and all these other benevolent races that were trying to warn us about nuclear weapons and don't destroy your environment, stuff like that, and hadn't really entered into the phase where we were talking about rays and abductions. Even though Betty and Barney Hill had already told their story, the national conception of the UFO and alien phenomenon, if there was one, was something very different from what we started to get to in the 70s and 80s, and with the Travis Walton incident and Communion, books and movies like that.
Yeah, by the way, if you hear some kind of banging in the background, it's not Bigfoot. I have two dogs that both have cones on their heads right now. And one is a 74-pound Siberian husky / lab mix with all they have is this oversized cone, and he's so pissed because he can't get into his kennel, he can't eat his Kong or whatever, so he's trying to figure life out right now. So if you hear some lumbering in the background,
I feel you, buddy. It's been that kind of year for me too.
We're all walking around with a cone in our head.
Yeah.
So let's go from UFOs to exorcism. The Pacetto family, the exorcism in Lee, is probably the most notable case in 1981, although there are other cases more historic before that.
Yeah, back in 81, that definitely made a lot of waves and got a lot of national headline. It's kind of funny how little remembered it is in the Berkshires now, but it was in, all over the Associated Press, and they went on Geraldo eventually. I remember that episode quite well, around 1990. And so the Pacetto family lived in Lee, and they reported a whole range of what they called demonic activity. There was a metal bookcase that was tipped over and bent in two, and they had scratches on them. And they had seen a kind of what they called an imp, some kind of 3-foot tall, ghoulish creature in their house. There was a lot of really overt phenomenon being reported. The police were called. Ed and Lorraine Warren eventually got involved, so that led to taking on an even higher profile. Of course, they were the go-to Ghostbusters and demonologists for at least the Northeast all through the 80s, and involved in the Amityville horror and the popularization of that. A number of other cases that are slowly getting turned into movies. So I assume the Pacetto case and Lee will eventually get the movie treatment.
Yeah, this could. What's it called? The Conjuring franchise. This could be in the Conjuring franchise eventually.
It definitely could.
Did it end in a successful exorcism, or how did it end?
The details on the exorcism, it was, it was certainly an unofficial exorcism, which it wasn't necessarily sanctioned by the church as an official exorcism, but Ed and Lorraine Warren worked with a network of different priests and things. So the case did certainly quiet down after that, and then they eventually sold the house and relocated. But I haven't heard in the intervening years. I haven't heard about any disturbances or strange goings on. So yeah, I'm still not sure what exact category to file that case in.
Yeah, it's good to have an exorcism though in the file, which is good. What about Camp Wendigo? It sounds like your Friday the 13th type thing. It's like these 1980s cabins that were haunted by 6 little girls and apparently a crazy female camp counselor. You want to tell us what happened there?
A lot of the story of Camp Wendigo has kind of been retconned in the time since it was abandoned. Certainly, like the stories of there being campers murdered, and there's no historical record of any of that happening. I was a kid in the 80s, and I think even I would have cared. We had a couple of other incidents of child murder and child abduction in the 80s and 90s, and they were hugely well known throughout the county and extensively discussed in the media. I think what you have with Camp Wendigo, from the start, there was a certain amount of curiosity about how it got its name, because the Wendigo in Native American legend is a supernatural creature in different traditions, having different powers and quite a feared being. But there's no sign of whether or not the people who started the camp originally named it had any sense of that, or if they were aware of those traditions, or if it just could have maybe even been an accidental, just a word that happened to be like a word in another language. The official Windsor history, the town of Windsor, says that the name comes from it being very, very windy on the hill there. So it was very windy, so they called it Wendigo. I don't know if that's, solid or not. So there's outstanding questions about the name of the camp, which I think adds to the sense of mystery. And then to see it's been torn down in recent years, but I got to explore it pretty extensively before that. And you can definitely see, it does scream. It does have a scream like Friday the 13th. Abandoned campsites. And a campsite, summer camp murder folklore is incredibly common, sort of like not almost to the point of hook-handed killer or people hiding in the backseat of your car. The tales that kind of have the same structure in many, many different towns and cities around the country. And I think as people went up there and partied and had seances and did ghost hunting, and the legend grew into this sort of epic thing where a whole bunch of kids have been murdered, even though there's no record of any of it going on.
Is that kind of what folklore is? Is it maybe not totally documented, but tales around the campfire from geographic areas that came and that may or may not have some semblance of truth? Or does a lot of folklore, is it rooted in truth that you kind of look at and write about?
I think a lot of it is rooted in someone's truth. Sometimes it can be an emotional truth. I was never trained as a formal folklorist. I did take a class in college, but that's about as far as it went. But I've read some really great contemporary folklore, and it seems to be a consensus that with folklore, you're dealing with a story about the past that could be true. It isn't necessarily true, and it isn't necessarily fabricated. It's sort of in this indeterminate area. It's a vague and very convenient word that we like to slap on a lot of things, because sometimes the historical record is fuzzy and there is a great deal of mystery and debate, so there's room for narrative devices that can tell us the emotional truth of the place or where we are that sometimes ring more true.
I think that's what our friend Jeff Belanger says. There are ghosts and legends is another way for folklore too, where it's legends, where it's kind of the stories passed down through generations. That's interesting. I wonder, are there any like Bigfoot folklore or anything? I know there is in the Bridgewater Triangle. In the Bridgewater Triangle, there's UFOs and there's satanic rituals and murders and all that stuff. Is there any kind of cryptid stuff going on in the Berkshires?
There really is. Yeah, there's a good bit. In fact, Loren Coleman gives the Berkshires a whole chapter in his Monsters of Massachusetts to the Berkshire Bigfoot. There are several different sighting accounts ranging from the earliest Bigfoot story in the Berkshires is quite old for this country, going all the way back to 1765.
Wow.
It's very probably a newspaper hoax, but it's revealing because I think it shows that even that far back, before the dawn of the United States, there was a concept in the Americas of ape-like creatures, at least talking about them and thinking that they may be out lurking in the woods among us. And then, of course, as a lot of the New England was deforested over the 1800s, I think it took on an even more of a mystique, because there was almost sort of, we were harkening back to a wilderness that we were in the process of destroying at the time. And of course, we've reforested a great deal of that now. And so it's under different names. Yeah, the traditions of Sasquatch-like creatures go back to the 17 and 1800s in the Berkshires, both hoaxes and question mark indeterminate sightings. Some of those sightings of the Winstead Wild Man was a famous one of the 1890s.
Let's go back to the tried and true ghost aspect of the Berkshires. There's a couple stories I'm thinking of. There's the Mount with Edith Wharton, the Edith Wharton estate in Lennox. I think you mentioned there's the Searles Castle in Great Barrington. And maybe a third one would be the Old Coot of Greylock. I wonder if you could maybe wrap up by talking a little bit about each of those three stories.
Sure. The Mount has been a source of many ghost stories going back to when it was abandoned in the 1990s before it was restored and turned into a venue again. Well, the Mount was Edith Wharton's kind of attempt to, not only her estate, but also her comment on many things. It was the child of her architectural views and ideas. And so even though she didn't actually live there all that long, it did take on a lot of mystique. Henry James, who was another great writer of stories, including ghost stories. And Henry James had some real storytelling chops in the ghost arena. He spent a great deal of time there. There's always been a certain amount of rumor and hearsay that they were romantically, intertwined. So Edith and Teddy Wharton, as well as Henry James, have all been seen or experienced in different ways by people there. The Mount is kind of an interesting example of, I guess it's really kind of a cultural sea change in how tourism relates to the whole area of the paranormal. I can remember, when I was starting my column in 2004 or 2005, and I'd be going to some of the local inns and theaters, and very, very few of them wanted to talk about sightings of ghosts. It was still kind of almost the Scooby-Doo idea of like, it'll drive people away if it's haunted. And then that really has just done a complete 180 to people will definitely come if they think it's haunted. So there's been definitely an embrace by the Mount. They do real booming business in October with doing nighttime tours of the property that are very different from the kind of tours you get the rest of the year. I think I've been to a Halloween party that was there that was just outstanding. It has all the flavor of the Gilded Age phantom ray that you could want. And I think that really, it's like the pinnacle of literary. There's other literary ghosts in the Berkshires and more minor stories, but the Mount's really become an icon for it. But Searles Castle is a great place too.
Yeah, I was going to say, a segment of Searles Castle, because you don't usually think of castles in the Berkshires, but there's a couple of them.
Edward Searles was an interesting guy. He was a decorator for the house was actually built. I hesitate to even call it a house, but the estate was built for Mary Hopkins, who at the time was the widow of Mark Hopkins, and she was the richest woman in the country. She had millions from the railroads. So she retained Searles to be her decorator and kind of create this palace for her. And in the process, he became her suitor, even though he was 20 years her junior. And there was a little air of scandal around that. It was thought that he almost kind of browbeat her into marrying him by just scandalizing her by his attention, to the point that, she had to save face. But whatever the circumstances, he had this castle built for her at incredible expense. I mean, it was $20 million in 1890s money.
Oh my God.
So, exorbitant by today's standard. As some of these estates at the turn of the century were and are now, just, they have to be schools or something else now, as Searles Castle is. But it was a bit suspicious to people because Mary Hopkins died within year and a half of the completion of the castle. And there were rumors that Searles was dallying with a servant, and they making attempts to scare her and give her a heart attack and things like that. And she eventually died of pneumonia, as I recall. But there's a secret staircase in the castle that runs between two floors. Got occasion to see it a few years back. It's just kind of a door in the wall that opens up, and this tiny little secret staircase. And it's thought that maybe that was used for nefarious purposes. But But it's a magnificent structure, and he built a couple. He went on from after he got irritated with the town of Great Barrington. He went on to build another really large castle in New Hampshire, in addition to his giant estate in Methuen, Mass. So he was really into building big, almost monstrously big palatial structures.
It was the Trump of castles before.
Yeah.
Hey, one place I forgot to mention before we close with the old Coot of Greylock, the Houghton Mansion in North Adams, chauffeur John Witters. I call him the chauffeur John Witters because he was the man driving when a tragic accident happened, which he took, I guess the story goes, he took his life for afterwards because he felt such guilt. Want to just regale us with that a little bit, and then we'll close with kind of a highlight version of the old Coot of Greylock.
Sure. Yeah. The Houghton Mansion is definitely an interesting building. That was it was the former mayor of North Adams' home, and as you mentioned, there was a terrible automobile accident that killed his daughter. John Witters, feeling responsible, did take his life on the property. I think that really started to get talked about in the 90s when it became owned by the Freemasons. And so the Masonic Lodge there, a couple of guys that come to know quite well, got really interested in the history of the house and in some of the things that they were kind of hearing and seeing in the building at night, different times of day. So actually for a while, it was sort of the resident home of the Berkshire ghost hunters. And they were kind of like a TAPS style paranormal investigation group. They would use their equipment and they would host ghost hunting events and overnights and things like that there. So, I mean, I think when you have that receptivity towards it, like the Houghton Mansion did and the Mount, you open up a whole other door for people to come in and, investigate in ways that a normal building might not. The Houghton Mansion has become one of the most extensively investigated haunted houses possibly in southern New England. You can find quite a bit online. People have posted EVPs that they've recorded, and there's photos of what appear to be people in the building when no one was there. There's a quality of evidence associated with that building that's interesting to me.
Let's close on the old Coot of Greylock, kind of a tragic family love story about a guy who had to go to war. His bride remarried, and he came back later on and stayed in the shadows. Even had dinner with them, but they didn't know it was him. And then he just died without them knowing. His spirit lingers on, I guess. You want to give us the quick story of how that unfolded?
Yeah, it's really a classic kind of Civil War era story of the loss and the alienation that I think a lot of people felt. And you have a guy who went away and was thought to be dead and then returned. And yeah, they said he even worked on his old farm a few times without being recognized by his former wife. The interesting thing about the old Coot is that that almost has the most known origin, because I think there was no mention of it in the early 1900s or late 1800s, right up until the guys wanted to start a ski race down the Thunderbolt Trail of Mount Greylock. And then all of a sudden, almost like an early viral marketing campaign, all of a sudden these stories of the old Coot started to come out in the local paper about this ghost that haunts this particular trail. And the North Adams Transcript has had this really kind of cheeky relationship with stuff like that. It's a newspaper that's no longer in business, but for the 150 years that they were very, they tended to be kind of on the playful side about stuff like that. And so I think over the years, there was multiple photos that were featured, probably doctored a little bit. They seem a little bit hokey, but it certainly got a lot of press, and it's certainly helped popularize the ski race.
Did he freeze to death or something? Was it winter and he kind of got snowed in and he was found frozen to death or something?
That's the story. Yeah, he was discovered dead of exposure and after a particularly bad storm. I can't remember the year offhand. There's some kind of there's been some drifting. He either haunts the Thunderbolt Trail or the Bellows Pipe Trail or appeared other trails. We have a park ranger at Mount Greylock State Forest, Mike Whalen, Ranger Mike, who is one of the best campfire storytellers of all time, and he tells an amazing version of the old coup.
That's awesome. No, that's you gave us quite a smattering of the Berkshires, so thank you so much. Is there anything that you're working on or that may be coming out in 2021, which we hope will be a better year than 2020? And if so, how can we follow you and keep up with what you're working on?
I hope to have a book been long awaited and had some holdups, but I hope to have a book called These Mysterious Hills out in 2021, and folks can follow me on Facebook. Look for These Mysterious Hills or go to thesmysterioushills.com. And I update pretty regularly still with stories and odd historical finds and just generally creepy gothy stuff. So definitely check it out on Facebook, These Mysterious Hills or thesmysterioushills.com.
This is cool. Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it. Sharing your knowledge and giving us a flavor of the Berkshires. We look forward to following you on Facebook and look forward to your book coming out in 2021.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode. And the world will know how swell you are.